The city of Cleveland in the early 1990s was a community deeply scarred by industrial collapse and economic despair, where the crumbling infrastructure and widespread poverty created landscapes of abandonment that became fertile ground for predators who preyed upon the most vulnerable and overlooked members of society. It was within this environment of systemic neglect that a serial killer began to operate with terrifying brazenness, targeting women whose marginalization made them effectively invisible to the authorities and media outlets that might otherwise have sounded alarms much earlier in the investigation. The first concrete signs of this emerging pattern manifested in 1991, when the body of a woman was discovered discarded inside a common plastic garbage bag and left in a vacant lot on the city's economically devastated east side, a method of disposal that spoke not only of murder but of a profound contempt for the victim, who was treated as worthless refuse to be thrown away without dignity or recognition. This horrific discovery proved to be the initial thread in a much larger tapestry of violence that would unfold over the next 2 years, with victim after victim being strangled or asphyxiated before their bodies were sealed inside plastic bags and abandoned in derelict buildings, overgrown vacant lots, and other forgotten corners of Cleveland's most impoverished neighborhoods. The victims were predominantly African American women, many of whom were involved in survival sex work or struggled with substance addiction, factors that unfortunately caused their disappearances and deaths to be initially dismissed by overburdened authorities as the expected consequences of high-risk lifestyles, rather than potential evidence of a connected series of homicides. This tragic bias in the initial police response created dangerous delays in recognizing the horrifying pattern, allowing the killer to continue his campaign of violence with near-total impunity, while desperate families and community advocates pleaded for someone in power to recognize that something systematic and sinister was devastating their community. By the time the body count reached 5 victims, all found within a concentrated geographic area and all displaying the same signature garbage bag disposal method, even the resource-strapped Cleveland Police Department could no longer ignore the connections, and a special task force was quietly assembled to investigate what local media had begun calling the bag murders, or sometimes Cleveland's new torso killer, in a chilling reference to the city's infamous unsolved serial killer case from the 1930s. Despite this belated official recognition, the case received shockingly little public attention beyond the immediately affected communities, with newspaper coverage often relegated to brief interior sections and television news providing only minimal reports that failed to convey the true scale and horror of what was occurring in the city's shadows. This lack of media spotlight meant that women in vulnerable situations remained largely unaware of the specific threat they faced, while the killer continued to exploit the anonymity and desperation that characterized life on Cleveland's economic margins during this difficult period. The investigation faced monumental challenges from the very beginning, including the severely degraded nature of the remains due to prolonged exposure to the elements, the near impossibility of determining precise times of death, and the transient nature of the victims' lives, which made reconstructing their final movements and interactions an exercise in frustration and dead-end leads. Without access to modern DNA databases and with severely limited forensic resources available to them, detectives relied almost exclusively on traditional shoe-leather police work, conducting thousands of interviews in neighborhoods where deep-seated distrust of law enforcement ran high, and potential witnesses were often reluctant or afraid to come forward with information. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, dedicated investigators persisted in their efforts, eventually identifying 11 victims they believed were connected to the same killer based on the consistent methodology and geographic patterns, though some independent researchers and community advocates have suggested the actual number may be significantly higher, with other unsolved murders from the era potentially fitting the pattern, but lacking definitive forensic proof for inclusion. The killer's operational methodology suggested someone intimately familiar with the streets and rhythms of Cleveland's most neglected neighborhoods, someone who understood both the patterns of the city's underground economies and the specific locations where a body might remain undiscovered for weeks or even months, allowing crucial forensic evidence to degrade beyond any usefulness for investigation. The consistent use of garbage bags as a disposal method indicated both cold practicality and deeply symbolic contempt, a readily available means of containing and transporting a body, but also a final degrading statement about how the killer viewed his victims, not as human beings with inherent worth, but as mere waste to be discarded without a second thought. This psychological profile points toward an individual with profoundly deep-seated misogynistic and racist attitudes, likely someone who felt empowered and justified by preying on those he considered beneath societal notice or protection, and who derived particular satisfaction from the efficiency and anonymity of his methods and the prolonged mystery surrounding his identity. As the investigation stretched into 1993 without any significant breaks or viable suspects, the murders appeared to stop as suddenly and mysteriously as they had begun, leaving behind a haunting string of unanswered questions and grieving families who felt that their loved ones had been forgotten by everyone except those who knew them personally and continued to mourn their loss. The abrupt cessation of killings could indicate that the perpetrator had died, been incarcerated on unrelated charges, moved to another city to continue his crimes undetected, or simply decided to stop, confident that he had escaped justice and that his crimes would eventually fade into the general background noise of urban violence that often characterizes struggling American cities. For the detectives who had invested years working the case, this unexplained end offered no professional satisfaction, only the profound frustration of an unresolved puzzle and the lingering suspicion that the killer might still be out there somewhere, having never been held accountable for his actions and the lives he destroyed. In the 3 decades since the bag murders terrorized Cleveland's vulnerable communities, the case has remained one of the city's most troubling and persistent cold cases, periodically resurfacing in local media retrospectives during slow news cycles, but never receiving the sustained national attention afforded to other serial killer investigations of the same era that involved victims from different demographic backgrounds. Recent advances in forensic technology, particularly genetic genealogy and improved DNA analysis techniques, offer a fragile glimmer of hope that physical evidence preserved from the crime scenes might yet yield identification if matched against contemporary databases or through innovative genealogical research methods that have solved other long-dormant cases. However, the passage of time, the possible degradation of biological evidence, and the significant challenges of reviving a case with so many systemic obstacles and lost institutional knowledge make the path to resolution incredibly steep and frustratingly uncertain for those still seeking answers. The story of the bag murders is about much more than just a single unidentified killer. It serves as a stark and painful reminder of how social vulnerability can be ruthlessly exploited by predators and how systemic biases within law enforcement and media can allow patterns of violence to continue unnoticed and unaddressed for far too long, with devastating consequences. The victims, women with names, families, dreams, and stories, deserve to be remembered as more than mere statistics or anonymous entries in a cold case file, and their families deserve answers and justice that have been delayed for over 30 years despite their persistent efforts to keep these memories alive. As Cleveland continues to evolve and address its complex historical challenges, the eventual resolution of this case would represent not just belated justice for 11 individuals, but a powerful acknowledgement of the inherent value of every human life, regardless of economic circumstance, racial background, or personal history. What are your thoughts on the bag murders case and its troubling place in American criminal history? Why do you believe this extensive series of killings failed to gain the sustained national attention that other serial predator cases received during the same era? And what does this disparity tell us about which victims society prioritizes and which it systematically overlooks in our collective consciousness? Share your detailed theories and insights in the comments below. The archives of the Penance Files are always open for thoughtful discussion and collective investigation by our community of dedicated mystery enthusiasts who believe that no case should be forgotten. And if you believe that every victim of violent crime deserves justice and that every mystery, no matter how complex, cold, or historically neglected, deserves our persistent pursuit of truth and resolution, then please subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell to join us as we continue to seek answers, honor the forgotten, and explore the darkest chapters of criminal history in our relentless quest to bring clarity and closure to these enduring enigmas. Next on the Penance Files, the flat tire murders, the ruse of Elias Abuelazam. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story from the archives.